Also, Acts 2:8 states, "And how is it that we hear each in our own language in which we were born?" Now, most Pentecostals, completely ignoring the context that these are Jewish speakers, will assume that this refers to a multiplicity of pagan languages, or Babel. But these people were Jews, and so the language of their birth for Jews, obviously, blatantly obviously, must refer to Aramaic or Greek or Hebrew, because no Jew ever identified then or now with the pagan culture within which they lived. Finally, the word tongues is a plural at Acts chapter 2 verse 4 and chapter 2 verse 11, because the natural tongues of the hearers were Aramaic and Greek in the vernacular. Okay, it would be Hebrew in the spiritual, the higher language was spiritual, but the vernacular was Aramaic and Greek. You can go through the list in Acts chapter 2 verse 7 to 11. Most of them would have been Aramaic speakers, some would have been Greek, and a great many both Greek and Aramaic. Just as Acts 2:8 so clearly states, possibly the worst mistreatment of Acts 2:7 to 11 is the current Pentecostal claim that on the Feast of Weeks, this great Jewish feast where they celebrated the giving of the law in Hebrew, that God is here giving the church the languages of the surrounding pagan nations. Can you see how crazy that is? The Feast of Weeks celebrating God giving the law, the 10 Commandments to Moses on Sinai in Hebrew. Now we have Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks, and God is overruling that. He's now giving a new revelation, a new tongue, that he's giving the gospel in the vernacular language, Aramaic and Greek. That's the obvious interpretation. But why would God on the day of Pentecost wish to give pagan languages to his own people? That's crazy. Mad. So why would God do such a thing? The modern tongues movement is frankly the worst worldwide infection of pagan occultism into the church, as evidenced by their pagan tongues, which even they admit is just babbling, that the church has ever seen in 2,000 years. And that really is the case. It is through the Pentecostal charismatic movement that the Protestant faith has been effectively destroyed within 2 generations. One or two points I'd like to finish with. As I say, Zehusen's paper didn't deal with the Feast of Weeks, and I feel it should have, but it was still an excellent piece of scholarship. So consider the Feast of Weeks, consider that context. The second thing is, if you read Acts 1:26, you find the context there would be the 12 apostles. It reads, "And they cast their lot, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles." Acts 1:26. So the context would be the 12 apostles. Then on the next verse, Acts 2:1, it says, "When the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all accord in one place." Now, the context for "they" would be the 12 apostles of the previous verse. You see, the context would be the 120 in Acts chapter 1, verse 15. It then changes to the 11 apostles in Acts chapter 1, verse 21 to 22. They then add Matthias to their number, and it was the apostles who added Matthias to their number, not the 120. You didn't have the women casting lots to see who would be added. It was the male apostles who added Matthias. So therefore, by Acts 1:26, the context would be the 12 apostles. And unfortunately, it is a terrible tradition that we have in the church today, that in Acts chapter 2, you have 120 men and women speaking in other languages. In Jewish culture, men and women were separate. Men and women would not sit together in the synagogues. It was rather like Islamic worship is today. They were kept separate. So what you have in Acts chapter 2 is the context of the temple courtyard, and here you have the 12 male Jewish apostles preaching the gospel in Aramaic and Greek, the vernacular, the secular tongue. And that is why we read in Acts 2:13, others mocking said, they are full of new wine, meaning drunk. You see, they were in the temple. They were supposed to be speaking Hebrew, and they were using Greek and Aramaic. Now consider this. Up until the 1960s, the Roman Catholic Mass was spoken in Latin. So if you went to a Catholic church 60, 70 years ago, and you heard the priest going through the ceremony of the Mass, which I don't accept, by the way, okay, and he said the Mass in English, your response would be, oh, he's drunk. He's been at the communion wine. He's been knocking back the communion wine, and that's why he's saying the Mass in English and not in Latin. Well, that's exactly the same situation here in Acts chapter 2. It was the temple. They should have been speaking in Hebrew. But God supernaturally inspired them to preach this message, this new message of Christ, in the secular vernacular tongue, Greek and Aramaic.